let me bring on Dr. Cornel West. Now he is running for the Green Party nomination for president. How you doing, Dr. West?
Oh, it's always a blessing, my brother.
I wanted to start, the main thing that I keep hearing about in the headlines about Cornel West is this word spoiler. And I know that you've probably heard it, but for those that haven't, I wanted to show you, my producer put this together. It seems like they all got on a call or something and decided on the message. Colin, if you could play, this is just like a little 45 seconds of the mainstream media's focus on Cornel West.
Cornel West, he's giving voters a choice that isn't Donald Trump. It's not Joe Biden. Or is he playing the role of a third-party spoiler?
Is Cornel West a spoiler in 2024?
Well, you have more than you have a third-party candidate now, and the Green Party candidate is pulling about 4 or 5% completely away from Biden. So if you want to talk about a spoiler, they should focus in on Cornel West.
The Green Party presidential candidate Cornel West, why he's running and how he answers concerns that this election could be too close to risk being a spoiler.
Actually create a real path that a third-party candidate has a lane, or is this just the same thing we're going to see over and over, and it's just another spoiler?
I worry about it being another spoiler.
Another threat to Biden's re-election bid comes from Cornel West, the former Harvard scholar who is mounting a Green Party presidential bid. He, too, rejects the label of spoiler.
So, by the way, that's just the last week or so. So I won't go any further than that. But, I found it interesting. This is not a new narrative. Obviously, Ralph Nader, Jill Stein, others have been attacked as this. But I found it interesting in light of all these polls that are coming out about President Biden. This recent poll had him basically tied with former President Trump. Trump's up by 1. You got Biden tied with DeSantis. You got Nikki Haley defeating Biden by 6 points in a head-to-head. Biden's barely beating Vivek Ramaswamy. Former Vice President Pence is beating Biden by 2 points. Tim Scott, the senator, by 2 points. Are you the spoiler, or is President Biden the spoiler?
Well, part of the problem is that the system as a whole is full of so much rot. It's Shakespearean. It's something is rotten in Denmark, something profoundly rotten in the political and economic system of the American empire. And if there was any serious commitment to democracy, we'd be really trying to institute ranked choice voting. We'd be trying to institute the abolition of the electoral college. We'd be trying to push proportional representation. If we were seriously concerned with Socratic dialogue and ensuring the voices of our fellow precious citizens, we'd be allowing a robust conversation about public life, the predicament, especially of poor and working people, rather than a two-party system that impedes Socratic dialogue, impedes democratic flourishing of poor and working people. And so it's very, very clear that, unfortunately, the oligarchs and plutocrats, they just don't have a commitment to a serious dialogue or democratic processes at all. It's very clear, very clear. We saw that with our dear brother Bernie. We tried twice with Brother Bernie, right? And I'm thoroughly convinced he was treated so unfairly and unjustly. And he knows that too. He knows he wasn't treated right. I'm still upset. In some ways, I might be more upset than he is. But whatever it is, and I love my brother, and I know he loves me, that we got deep disagreements about this moment. But the important thing is we got to move forward. We cannot allow any kind of false narrative to dampen our fire and not create an alternative vision, alternative infrastructures, alternative institutions, alternative space, given what is at stake, which is the destruction of the planet, not just the destruction of democratic possibilities, but the crushing of poor and working people. And of course, for me, in terms of my own particular tradition of the Black freedom struggle, this massive assault on Black people, mass incarceration, mass miseducation or non-education, unemployment, underemployment, so that the issues of class, the issues of white supremacy, of male supremacy, our sisters not gaining access to control of their bodies and reproductive rights and so forth. The defense of precious trans and gay brothers and lesbian sisters. This is not narrow identity politics. This is morality and spirituality having to do with the humanity of folk who are being degraded, being attacked and assaulted. And we can have our deep critique of capitalism as well as have our critiques of white supremacy, male supremacy, homophobia, and transphobia if we're broad enough in our vision.
Let's bring up, obviously, you had a contentious interview the other day with one Jimmy Dore. I'll leave my thoughts about Mr. Dore to the side, not really relevant. But I will say I really have for a long time thought that this whole race first class, I don't know if you would call it a debate in the left or just false dichotomy, is the wrong debate to have. I really did some research this morning, and I wanted to read to you two quotes that I think really illuminate something here. I'm sure you've watched the film 13th by Ava DuVernay about the 13th Amendment.
Yeah.
And in it, Michelle Alexander, obviously a renowned author and legal scholar, activist, she said something that really stood out to me. She said, this is, after the abolishment of slavery, and obviously they created, a new slavery, economic slavery. She said laws were passed that relegated African Americans to a permanent second class status. Keyword class status. I thought that was very powerful and shows that there is no class versus race or talking about class on one day and race on the other day, because Black people were never part of the same class that I have been privileged to be about. The second thing I wanted to read, which is an ugly quote, but we shouldn't sugarcoat it. This is from Lee Atwater, who was obviously Reagan's chief strategist, known as, some of the lowest of the low in terms of political strategy. And Lee Atwater, talking to some reporters, thought he was off the record back in 1980. He said on the Southern strategy, he kind of let the cat out of the bag. You start out in 1954 by saying N-word, N-word, N-word. By 1968, you can't say N-word. That hurts you. It backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract. Now you're talking about cutting taxes, and all these things you're talking about are totally economic things. And a byproduct of them is Blacks get hurt worse than whites. We want to cut this is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than N-word, N-word. And I bring these up because, Jimmy said to you, meet people where they are, or, white supremacy is identity politics. Well, isn't the whole point of running a movement or trying to do something that's never been done, a third party president? Isn't it trying to persuade people where they are? Your thoughts?
Absolutely. No, I think you say it well, though. I think we need to take very seriously the case of Tom Watson. You remember Tom Watson? The great C. Vanderbilt wrote a wonderful dissertation on him. He was one of the most serious, sincere populists trying to bring Black and white workers together. He actually would stand there with his gun protecting Black farmers because he was so committed to multiracial populist politics. It took a lot of courage to do that. Now he ends up one of the grand wizards of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, how do you account for Tom Watson's shift? Well, one of the ways he accounted for it himself was this multiracial thing is never going to work. White supremacy cuts too deep, and I'm still against the elites, but I'm going to conform to where they are now without pushing them. And therefore, I'm going to be a xenophobic populist rather than a serious progressive multiracial populist. Now, we know, Brother Jimmy's anti-racist in his sensibilities and so forth. There's no doubt about that. He's been very helpful to a whole host of Black folk. As you could tell, I didn't like his attitude at all. I didn't like his tone. over time. We started with a certain respect, but it tended to decline after that. And I don't have any patience for the most part. Folk who just kind of pontificate to tell you, I'm the coach, I'm the advisor, this is what you ought to do. Who's advising you? Well, I think for myself, but I shouldn't have to say that because you think for yourself. But I use the Watson example as an extreme example because we know white supremacy cuts so deep that you have a choice of either conforming or hitting it head on with your class politics. You don't give up on class just because you're talking about white supremacy.
It seemed that he was conflating talking about white supremacy with identity politics. And to me, those are two very different things. Can you talk about, what you consider to be identity politics versus vital life or death matters, which white supremacy obviously is?
Well, one is anybody who only talks about race independent of the way in which white supremacy has been interwoven within predatory capitalist processes, or anybody who talks about gender without connecting it to capitalist modes of production or sexual orientation and so forth. When you separate race and gender and sexual orientation from capitalist processes, which is talking about class, then you're on the way to neoliberal politics, which constitutes a class war against poor and working people, what I said before. But for him to somehow think that to raise the issues makes you necessarily a loser in your campaign because you're not in any way speaking to the Trumpites who are following him. Of course, the point I made was what? The Trumpites are not homogeneous either. They're not monolithic. 1 out of 8 of them voted for Bernie. 1 out of 12 voted for Barack. I could spend a whole lot of time with Trumpites. We can talk about a lot of things, music, sports, then we get to politics, and they talk about how great Trump is. And I said, no, he's a neo-fascist Pied Piper. Oh, you shut down the conversation. That's not true. People appreciate the honesty. Just because I call him that name doesn't mean I'm calling them a name. I wait and see what they have to say. But
it's funny you say that, actually.
You fascist, you've written off his whole movement, you're a loser. No, that's not true at all. On the ground, the interactions are different than the critique of the leader. I'm honest about the leader.
The only way you're going to get some type of Medicare for all, cutting the Pentagon budget, closing down, military bases around this world, a climate emergency, and at least $10 to $15 trillion in money towards the climate emergency. I could go on and on. Ending private prisons is through executive action. They'll scream on both sides. Dictator West. The lawsuits will be humming, and a lot of that will go to the Supreme Court. So how does a jazz man like you, a President West, obviously you wouldn't want to be a dictator, but I assume you're not afraid to use the pen. How would you get bold policy through in a corrupt Congress with lobbyists, not in your White House, but lobbyists outside the gates?
Well, the thing is that can you imagine? I mean, a lobby-free Congress is such an oxymoron at the present moment, given how deeply saturated the lobbyists are in the shaping of public policy. Same would be true with big pharmaceutical companies vis-a-vis policies in regard to public health and so on. But there's two things. One, there's a bully pulpit. As I said before, the social movement would have to be strong enough to keep the pressure on me as well as Congress to give me some room to maneuver, even as I'm a part of that social movement. And the second one would be, I would be robust in terms of the use of executive order, given the deep entrenched interests which are at work in Congress. And they could charge me with, unconstitutional. I'm not going to go beyond the Constitution in any ugly way, but even the Constitution itself oftentimes has been shaped by corporate interests. And I say, no, if I think the people's interest is actually being crushed, I'm going to stand up for that, and let's take it to court. I'm not going to be overthrowing all of the laws and all the courts, but let's take it to court. Let us reveal how the criminal justice system and the court system itself has been a rationalization of the rule of corporate power vis-a-vis working and poor people.
I think one of the major issues right now is Julian Assange. He is, withering away as a political prisoner. It's a human rights issue. It's a journalistic issue. We also should mention Leonard Peltier, been in prison for nearly 50 years, Native American.
Jamal and Brother El Hameen, who used to be known as H. Brown. I just wrote an introduction to the pamphlet of his just a few years ago. He's still there in Arizona. There's a number of folk who I'm thoroughly convinced are innocent.
Right. So what's your message? Because I'll tell you, I think a lot of Trump voters and neoliberals, out of sight, out of mind, might not even know who these people are. Will you be running on justice and actual criminal justice for political prisoners?
Oh, absolutely. First, we have to tell folk we still have a number of political prisoners in our prison system. You tell them a story about COINTELPRO. You tell them a story about Black Panther Party. You tell them a story about leftists. You tell them a story about blacklisting of communists and socialists. This is part and parcel of American history. And then those still alive who are still paying the cost. Give him a face. Put Mumia's face on television to tell his story and why I wrote 2 introductions to his books. Not just because he's my friend and my brother and my comrade, not just because I agree with everything he says, but because I'm thoroughly convinced he's innocent and his voice is a very important voice. Very much so. And let's be honest, too. This wonderful book by Jesse Jackson Jr., The Finger of God, that talks about the pardon power of the president. And that pardon shouldn't just be well-known persons. It should be a lot of folk who have been forgotten, who are innocent, who are rotten in these barbaric spaces we call the mass incarceration regime in America. And that pardon power is real. But Julian Assange would be one of the first. Similar so with Brother Snowden.
Look at these numbers in terms of greedy bosses. You have the GM executive, Mary Barra, $26 million salary last year. Stellantis CEO, almost $25 million. Ford, $21 million last year. You look at the company's profits. Ford, $24 billion last year. GM, $21 billion. Stellantis, $18 billion. And I'm interviewing workers that are working 2 jobs. I'm interviewing workers that are having to choose between medicine for their kids or groceries. I'm interviewing workers whose backs are literally breaking because they got to work longer hours. And these are tough, dangerous jobs. What is your view, by the way, of this newfound militancy? The new UAW president doesn't seem to be messing around. He says we want nearly 50% wage increases. He's given the numbers in terms of how much these CEOs have enriched themselves. And he has said we are ready and willing to strike as long as it takes.
I think it's a marvelous new militancy, my brother. I think of my dear brother Stanley Aronowitz, my dear sister Barbara Ehrenreich. These are my close companions and comrades of years past who was looking for this militant insurgency of the labor movement. I see Brother Sean and the others, and I say, yes, let us continue. And I know it has to do with the workers themselves putting pressure on their leadership. So leadership matters indeed, but it's the movement that puts pressure on the leadership. And when you have a leadership of courage and vision and integrity, you respond. You don't become complicit with the bosses. You don't come up with negotiations and settlements that do not do justice to your workers. Because class conflict and class struggle is integral to any capitalist society. It's going to take place one way or the other. And usually it takes place in such a way that workers have to bear the brunt of it and pay the cost of it. That's part of the escalation of profits and CEO salaries and the wage stagnation that we've been dealing with for the most part in the last 45, 50 years. So that I think it's a beautiful thing. We all have to be a part of it in a fundamental way. And this is true for Amazon. This is true for Hollywood. This is true for hotel workers. This is true for workers across the board. But and I know, very much like the Black movement, you got neoliberal versions of the Black movement that accommodate themselves to Biden and the Democratic Party. You've got a kind of business unionism in the trade union movement that will easily accommodate itself to the Democratic Party and Biden and so forth. And so we end up with having to engage in a critique of certain trade union leaders who don't want to be as bold as those militant ones. Just as we have a critique of black leaders or women leaders who don't want to be as bold and stay in neoliberal zones and don't want to be as bold vis-a-vis the Democratic Party, and then again overlook the fascist elements of certain policies of the Democratic Party as well. So I think it's a marvelous thing, and I plan to be. The same is true next week with the Climate Week in New York City. We're dealing with fossil fuel companies, greedy, myopic, short-sighted, willing to push the planet off the cliff for short-term profits. We have to raise our voices. We've got to show a united front across the board. I plan to be there as well. Same is true in Atlanta. Cop City, look what's happened with Cop City. Now they've criminalized even civil disobedience. Uhuru 3, Pendleton 2. We can go on and on and on in terms of the ways in which the Department of Justice has been used in such a way that it tries to let freedom fighters know you better not go too far. We want that fear inside of you. And as long as we have fear and feel intimidated and scared, we don't raise our backs. And you can't raise your back and be a serious freedom fighter. You just can't do it. And the UAW workers, I think next week, I hope and pray, get a chance to become Exhibition A and B in this regard, in the same way that the 61 in Atlanta are already Exhibition Pre-A and Pre-B, because this is a serious situation right now, very much so.